we have succumbed to the threat of the Delta strain of the COVID virus, and southeast Queensland is currently in lockdown, while signs are relatively good at the moment. We will be in lockdown until Sunday, which means I can't drive more than 10 kilometres from home. So I decided to come down to this park that I've done a couple of videos before in. It's a short walk from our place and it's a beautiful space. So thanks for joining me today. G'day, I'm Roland Hearn and this is a walk in the garden. There was a couple of things that I wanted to tidy up from last week's video before moving on to the rest of the story today. And as much as it was difficult to keep it constrained last week, it's going to be even more today, because it basically covers the next 40 years. However, just two quick things. In that video I pointed out that there was a fence that guarded the medium strip that wasn't there when the accident happened. I had intended to say something about that, which is why I pointed it out. If that fence had been there, it would probably almost certainly true that the car would have bounced off it and remained on the road. The car rolled because it slipped off the road into a gully that the medium strip was in fact a gully, and it was that sliding motion into the gully that created the rolling of the car. The other and much more important issue was that the story, as I shared it, and as I've shared it all across the years, is about my pain and my struggle, and the way that it creates the context for the journey of the rest of my life. I am extremely and painfully aware that that experience is much more than simply about my life. It caused pain and irreparable damage to the families of the family of those sisters, and of course to my friend that was in the car as well, that suffered equally from those experiences. As the driver of the vehicle, of course, I carry an enormous amount of responsibility, and while I can look at the circumstances and say, well, this happened and that happened, and had they not happened, then the accident wouldn't happen. At the end of the day, I was still the driver, and the pain that has resulted for so many people is, from that, creates for me a struggle where I haven't even across all of these years been particularly able to think about that. I carry this overwhelming sense of wanting to make that right, but I can't. And I had not been going out long enough with my girlfriend to even have met her family. And so they had nothing to do with me after the accident, which was perfectly reasonable. And there's no way to fix that. But I can't imagine that even 40 years later, that whole family still doesn't carry enormous pain about that day. And all of that together heightens the sense of shame that I carry across my life, and it is then the context that sets up the rest of the journey. So let me share that with you, knowing that what I'm sharing is my personal struggle with that reality. The following years were filled with blackness and bitterness, the most intense form of shame, that self-loathing, self-hatred, blackness, emptiness, loneliness, and bitterness is a good word to describe that. But then one night, as I was struggling to go to sleep, I felt a very real presence in my apartment room. As a used car salesman, I was making a lot of money and trying to build a life that would address the pain. I was living in the center of the Brisbane city, the downtown area, in this beautiful high-rise apartment complex, a luxury apartment, and just struggling constantly with my own reality. And then one night, I felt this warm presence of love come into my room. Having been brought up in a Christian home, I immediately identified that sense with the presence of Jesus Christ embracing me. I sensed that God was saying, I want you back. And given all that I said about how I had come to understand God as a result of the accident, that was in direct opposition to the presence that I felt that night. The presence of God was real, it was loving, it was embracing, and it was communicating to me a worth that despite my life, despite the accident, despite all of the ways that I tried to manage my pain since then, God wanted relationship with me. God wanted to embrace me. God wanted to love me. What transpired was this very clear sense that God had neither allowed or caused the accident to happen for some grander purpose. In that moment, what I sensed was worth and love embracing me. And I remember thinking the words, God, if you can actually make something out of this messed up life, then I will come back to you. And this peace flooding over my life, the instant removal of the bitterness, it was just gone. And in place of the blackness was this light, this sense of hope, this sense of love. It didn't change the reality of my circumstances, but it repositioned me, my identity, and my reality against the backdrop of love and honor and worth, as opposed to shame, despair, and blackness. That my circumstances didn't tell me who I was. And I remember surrendering to that sense. And my life dramatically changed at that point. I very, very quickly accepted a reality that said that I should give my life away. I know that a very big part of that acceptance was an idea that said my worth would be in the extent to which I could create meaning out of that chaos, and by giving my life away to others, I could somehow bring balance to that reality that I've been in. That's not what God was saying to me. That's the way that I processed that. So very quickly, about 3 or 4 months, I decided I was going to change the course of my future, and I was going to go back to college and study for pastoral ministry. And I was going to be a church pastor, a leader. And so I went to Nazarene Bible College, as it was called then, Nazarene Theological College as it is today. Started a journey of understanding that piece by piece has brought me to a clarity about this life journey that we have been on. Something else happened. The principal of the college then, a wonderful gentleman named Grady Cantrell, wonderful memories of Grady and his wife Dorothy, actually talked to me prior to my going to college and suggested that I come to college to study so that I could prepare for the future. And one of the things that he used to attract me into that space was, he said, I have this lovely girl that's come to college, you should come just to meet her. Well, it didn't appeal to me. I didn't want to change the reality, change the memory, move on from that space. My heart had been given to one that had been taken from this world, and I didn't want that to change. And so I wasn't really interested in that, but increasingly I sensed this need to explore what it meant to prepare for a life of giving myself away. But that young lady was in fact there, and it didn't take very long before I started noticing her. A couple of weeks after starting college, we went to see a movie together. But what I do remember is sitting in that theater with a bunch of other students next to this girl. And as we sat there, our arms were juxtaposed on the armrest, and I literally, I mean literally, experienced electrical sparks jumping from my arm to her arm. Something magical was happening, and we started to talk after that. And back up, it literally felt like there was sparks jumping from my arm. There weren't actually physical sparks, but it literally felt like that. About 2 weeks later, we had conversations, but 2 weeks later we were having a conversation together at actually personal level. We started talking to each other about our lives, and sitting there on a log, we started talking about what it would be like if our lives joined together. And we decided that we would get married, have 6 kids, and we named those kids. And my first 2 born children are actually names that we chose there on that night. The incredibly beautiful Emmy, young, passionate, loving, giving, gracious, wonderful, stepped into my life and became the one that shaped the healing for me. I've learned more about love from my life journey with Emmy than anything else. And the honest truth is, while my girlfriend that passed away in the car accident, I said I loved, and I'm certain I did. We'd only been going out together for a couple of months, and so it was very unformed love. But what I experienced is not even remotely close to the journey of love that I've taken with my wife across these 35 years. She is my life, and the only constant in my life that brings me back to the space of what love really means over and over again. So that sounds like a happy ending story, but of course it isn't. That's not the end, it's just the beginning. I did become a pastor, and pastored a couple of churches here in Australia, and then the opportunity came for me to go to go to America, to Texas actually, and start a church in Texas. And all through that process, I am very aware that I was living out of that space, if you can make something out of my life. And so I was very, very aware that I was trying to make something out of my life in obedience to that conversation. Never, even still, all the bitterness gone, this wonderful new life, this wonderful relationship with my wife, children coming along, new context, all of that time I was struggling with this sense that I wasn't good enough. I could not do enough to make up for my worthlessness, my inadequacies. And it followed me. I could never be happy with anything. Eventually I found ourselves in Texas. My wife and I found ourselves in Texas. And by this stage, my personal struggle had pushed us to the point where Emmy wasn't sure that she could remain in that relationship with me. And she came to me one day and said, I think I want out of this relationship. And there were lots of things going on in her life that were a part of that, but that's not my story, that's her story. And here I was in America. People had paid for me to be there. They'd given me this opportunity. My marriage was in tatters. My stress level was massively high. I was again in that whirlpool of feeling like my life was being driven by my worthlessness. And here my wife had come and said that she wasn't sure she could keep going. And I know the feeling that started overwhelming me. It was the same kind of chaotic feeling around that I experienced around the accident. The loss of my love, the loss of my future, the loss of my career. And one thought continuously manifested through that time. I'm going to go back to Australia without my family, without my career, without my future. And that feeling of worthlessness totally overwhelmed me. And so much so that I had something of a disconnection with reality that Emmy responded to by asking assistance of a friend, and they put me in a hospital, in a mental health ward. And in that hospital, I was locked into a room at night under suicide watch. And again, that same presence entered my room. I had a journal that I was keeping notes on in this process, and I wrote in that, God must be God and love must be enough. So I'm not God. I've got to let God be God and let God do what God does. And what God does is love. So love has to be enough. Love has to be the mandate of my life, and it is the way that God relates to me. Most people process the idea of God as the one that is overseeing, permitting, allowing, controlling, either directly or indirectly, everything that takes place. The problem with that is that you can only hold that value if you say that all tragic, horrible events like the ones that I went through are directly or indirectly the result of God's activity. And you can only rationalize that if you come to the idea that God has this master plan. Well, if God has a master plan that he's working on, then we are just pieces in that plan. We're less than significant, and our worth is directly attached to the part that we play in that plan. Well, that ultimately is not love. So God can't be love. So the only other conclusion that we can come to is that God is not in control beyond the control that love can influence in a situation or a circumstance. We live in a world that is our reality. Random events happen, some for good, some for bad. And in the middle of all of that, God is journeying with all of humanity, drawing us all to a space where we understand that he loves us and values us. And that has been communicated most effectively by the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that reality has made it possible for all of humanity to come to a space where we understand that God is indeed love, and that he desires us to live in that space of love, so that as we move through the context of our lives, that reality, as random as it is, does not have the capacity to take away our worth and our significance, the reality that we are indeed loved. God's ultimate plan is not some end game that he is moving pieces on a chessboard to reveal that he is adequately God. God's ultimate plan is that I and you experience love and worth in the context of a relationship with the one that is in fact all loving. And I remember hearing someone who was in opposition to the idea of faith saying, God can't be all powerful and all loving. If you believe in an all powerful God, you can't believe in an all loving God. You know what? I think that's true, to the extent that power means controlling circumstances. I think God is all powerful. He is all powerful to be able to adequately reflect love regardless of what the circumstances, so that in any given moment we can know that we are indeed valuable and honored and loved, and we are worth the God of the universe loving us individually and personally. And one of the key ingredients in that is that we experience lostness, that our identity does not matter significantly. When we experience love in the context of that relationship, we realize that individually we matter and we are significant. And the wonder of that is that value, that worth, that honor can only be lived out in community with other people that are experiencing that same journey. So it's never about us alone, it's about us in journey, us in context, us in relationship. And so the journey in the garden, the walk in the garden, becomes about that process of discovery. So I was in hospital for 3 days, and in that process Emmy returned to me, and with love and graciousness and beauty that is her, she said to me, I want to keep going. And within a couple of months we actually had started that church, and we built that church entirely on the idea that God must be God and love must be enough. And I've tried to live that way with the rest of my life. I have certain areas of leadership and responsibility within the church. I try very, very, very hard not to allow my ideas and my need to control outcomes to impact other people for whom I hold some level of responsibility. I don't always achieve those goals, but that's the drive of my life. I want people to experience love and grace and freedom. I want that for my family. I want that for my friends. I want that for everyone that might watch this video. This whole journey, I've been very careful to try and frame faith in ways that would honor people that don't have faith in this process, to give them space. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm trying to reflect on the journey that is the walk in the garden. So this walk in the garden that I'm going to be wrapping up next week has attempted to be an exploration of that reality. My journey's not over. I've got plenty of struggles still to go. I've got plenty of inadequacies. I'm in this walk. I'm seeking to get back to that place of love and relationship that was expressed in the model portrayed by the original garden. But the key is, there came a point in my life where my identity shifted from an identity of shame to an identity of love. And the rest of the journey has been the reprogramming of my brain and consistent with that identity, with that understanding. And that's the space that the walk in the garden has come from. Well, thank you for being with me this week. As I wrapped it up, I know this has been a long video, and I appreciate if you've got this far. I've appreciated you staying in the journey with me. So until next week, keep walking in your garden.